Hello and welcome to week 16 of Wine Wednesdays with KVB Estate Winery. I'm Winemaker Freddy Arredondo, and behind the camera is Carrie Arredondo. So what is our question this week, Carrie?
Our question this week comes from Courtney, and Courtney lives here in Spokane, Washington, which is about 2.5 hours from KV Estate Winery at our Quincy location. And she is wondering, since the days are getting hotter over here, what is the best temperature to keep her wines at, both for the whites and for the reds?
All right, a good question, Courtney. So for storage temperature, the best temperature to keep your wine at ideally is like 55 degrees with a pretty decent relative humidity. So that obviously you need a wine cellar for that. And not all of us have a wine cellar. So I'm going to put this out to basically everybody and how we can store our wine when we don't have a wine cellar. So the best thing to do is to store your wine in an area that doesn't see a lot of temperature fluctuation. So if there's a hall, like a closet in the middle of your house in a hallway, that's like the best place because that's the place that sees the least amount of temperature fluctuation. So really the biggest thing is to try and avoid temperature fluctuation and exposure to direct sunlight. Those are the biggest things, but ideal temperature is definitely 55 degrees with decent relative humidity.
Thank you, Freddie. Another portion of the question is, what temperature should she serve her wines at for a dinner party or whatnot, both for the whites and for the reds?
So that question is definitely a little more complicated because it really depends when you really want to get down to it. It depends on the type of wine. So a really light, crisp, bright white wine is going to want to be colder than, for example, a barrel fermented Chardonnay, which you're going to want to serve a little bit warmer. Still cold, but a little bit warmer. So when I say cold and warm, a really bright, crisp wine, you're going to want to serve that in like probably the high 30s, about 37 would be nice. And then for a Chardonnay, that's a barrel fermented Chardonnay, a little rounder, kind of a buttery mouthfeel and flavor profile. That you're going to serve probably more in the 50 to 53 degree range. Your red wines, ideally you want to serve your red wines at about 60, 62 degrees. Again, lighter body, you want to serve them at actually reds in general, you want to serve them in that temperature range, in that high 50s, low 60s ideally. Obviously we can't always have that, but those are the ideal temperatures to serve.
So Freddie, sometimes we have people that come into the tasting room and they tell us when they're at their beach house or whatnot and it's so hot that they throw a few ice cubes into their red wine, and you cringe every time and have a little conversation with them. So can you tell us what that conversation is?
You know, the biggest thing is that when you put ice cubes in a wine, what happens is you're actually just diluting the wine. So you're diluting the beautiful aromatics and the subtleties that are in the wine. Now, that being said, if you absolutely have to have your wine cold, you have to do what you enjoy. But me personally, it's just I lose so much of the finer points in the wine when it's not at the right temperature. Even for a white wine, when it's too cold, you lose some of those finer temperatures, and by chilling it with ice, it does get a little bit too cold. Yeah.
Thank you. That's an important thing for people to understand. Another important thing that we often talk about in the tasting room is when it's hot outside. We tell people to leave their wine in the tasting room for a while. Don't go put it in their car and go on a hike and whatnot. Why is that?
Yeah, that's actually because as again we talk about temperature fluctuation, but actually heat degrades the wine tremendously. And when you have extreme heat, since we have cork finished wines, what happens is the cork actually pushes through the top of the bottle because the wine, as it heats up, it expands and it pushes that cork up, which can cause seepage out of the bottle. Also, the wine will, quote unquote, cook. When you cook a wine, you actually lose a lot of aromatic compounds, a lot of flavor compounds. So it really does ruin the wine. And, when you've taken the time to curate your wines, it's really kind of a bummer when you let them get too hot and then you lose all of those finer points that you really liked when you tasted it. And so it's not because the wine is bad and you had you're not remembering your experience correctly. It's because the wine got too warm. So you really want to avoid, even when you buy wine, you want to avoid transporting it in the trunk. And it's always best to transport it in the cab of the car. If you're comfortable with the temperature, the wine is comfortable with the temperature. And that goes for extreme cold too. So if the wine's riding in the trunk of the car, and it's 10 degrees outside, that wine's going to get really, really cold, and you really don't want it to get that cold either. So yeah, let your wine ride in the cab with you.
That's great. So going back to being too hot, can you give a sense of the temperature for that?
Really, anything above 85 degrees is gonna be pretty detrimental to wine. Once you have sustained temperatures in that high 80s to 90s, it really does wreak havoc on a wine. But actually, sustained temperatures of 75 or more are eventually gonna start to degrade that wine also. Also with our white wines, if they get too warm, they're gonna get what's called a protein haze. So what happens is that the wine starts looking cloudy, and in some cases it starts having these like wispy little things that go through it, and that's basically just proteins that are in the wine that when they got too hot, it just coagulated basically and turned into a solid from a liquid. Think of it like an egg white, okay? Egg whites, when they're raw, they're clear. As soon as they see heat, they turn white and they get solid. Same thing, that's basically straight up protein. So wine has not the same protein as egg whites, but proteins in it. So it does do the same thing. As soon as it sees heat, it coagulates and it turns opaque rather than clear.
So I know we have some wine club members in some hot areas of the country, such as Florida and Texas. So what happens for people listening? Our wine club shipments go out in May, in September, November, and February. So I know oftentimes we have some issues in May and September in those states that are still quite hot. So what do we do for those?
Right. So what we try and do for those states is we actually try and ship as early May as we can, so that we can see a good temperature range. And what we do is we actually follow the route of the wine all the way to its destination, and we look at the forecast. We have a shipping module that allows us to do that. So we check the forecast all along the route that wine is going to be taking. And if we see sustained temperatures above 80 degrees, we really try and hold the wine as much as possible. There are some instances where the customers really, really, really want the wine, next day. We can make special accommodations, but they do get expensive, like, next day air, and we pack it with ice packs and things like that. But again, that does get quite spendy to do that. So typically what we do for our wine club members is we try and ship early, like the very beginning of May and sometimes even at the end of April. And for September, oftentimes we see warm windows pretty late, so we just hold on to the wine until we see a good shipping window. Now, if it so happens that we can't get the wine or the orders received in a time where we can't realistically ship the wine for a number of months, we will contact the customer and say, hey, look, it's just going to be way too warm to ship the wine until realistically until the fall. And then we let the customer make the decision at that point, because sometimes there are vintages that they want to make sure that they get, and we may be out of the vintage by the time we can ship the wine. So they'll ask us to hold on to that vintage that they really liked for them. Yeah. So I think that's it. So thank you very much. We'll see you next Wednesday.